I had exactly 12 steps before I reached his table, and according to the man with the silence clock by the kitchen door, Seo Jin-tae had exactly 30 seconds before he became a ghost. My fingers fumbled with the edge of the customer's bill, my sweat blurring the ink of the warning I'd scrawled in a panic. The paper felt like a live wire in my hand, dangerous enough to save his life or end mine before I could even set it down. Around me, the Aurelian grill glowed with the suffocating warmth of old money and gold leaf. It was the sound of heavy silver hitting bone china and the low, melodic hum of people who have never known a day of hunger. Outside, the city was a blur of gray rain and neon, but in here, the air was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and the ozone of an approaching storm. I walked toward table 4 like a woman approaching the gallows. Seo Jin-tae sat there, his back to the room, looking less like a man and more like a predator carved from obsidian. His black suit was sharp enough to bleed on, and the ink of the tattoos peeking above his collar matched the darkness in his eyes. He was calm, terrifyingly so, his fingers tapping a slow, rhythmic beat on the tablecloth. Beside him sat Chloe, his mistress, her laughter sounding like wind chimes. She looked radiant, leaning in to whisper a secret in his ear. She looked like his greatest supporter. She wasn't. 10 minutes ago, I had realized the security standing at our kitchen entrance weren't the men who had walked in with him. I'd seen the subtle sign, the way the lead guard didn't check the service light, a protocol every one of Jin-tae's men lived by. I'd lingered a second too long near the prep station, my heart hammering against my ribs as I saw the glint of a suppressed barrel hidden beneath a server's cloth. I wasn't just a waitress anymore. I was the only person in the room who knew that the king was about to fall. Before we reveal the moment the first shot was fired and Naomi's world changed forever, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe. Now, tell me in the comments, if you were holding that note and looking into the eyes of a mafia boss, would you walk away or walk toward the fire? Let's get into a shocking next move. I moved through the Aurelian grill like a ghost in a polyester blend shroud. To the men who sat at these tables, men who traded in oil futures, privatized prisons, and city council votes, I didn't have a name. I didn't even have a face. I was just a pair of steady hands that refilled sparkling water and a silent shadow that cleared away the wreckage of $300 Wagyu steaks. My life was measured in the rhythmic, soul-crushing clink of silver against bone china and the perpetual, burning ache in my arches. It was a grueling cycle designed to keep my head exactly 1 inch above the rising tide of my mother's medical bills and the predatory interest rates of the South Side. At the Aurelian, you learn to see without looking. It was a survival skill, a byproduct of being part of the furniture. You noticed which senator was holding hands with a woman who wasn't his wife beneath the heavy white linen. You heard the whispered numbers of a pharmaceutical merger weeks before they hit the wire. They thought the uniform made me deaf and blind. They were wrong. It made me a silent scholar of their sins. Tonight, the air in the dining room felt different. It was heavy, charged with the static tension that precedes a massive midsummer blackout. My station included table 4, the center of the room's gravitational pull. Seo Jin-tae sat there, a man whose reputation was a dark, jagged legend in the city's underbelly. Yet here he was, the very picture of refined, clinical menace. I had served him before. He was always precise, never looked at me, and tipped in crisp, sequential $100 bills that smelled faintly of mint and ozone. He sat with a terrifying stillness, his back to the room, while beside him, Chloe, a woman whose beauty was as sharp and cold as a diamond, laughed at something he hadn't even finished saying. As I glided past the velvet curtain of the kitchen entrance to retrieve a bottle of vintage Bordeaux, my internal alarm, the one honed by 24 years of navigating treacherous streets, began to scream. I saw the security detail stationed by the service door. At a distance, they were perfect, dark suits, coiled earpieces, expressions of bored stone. But as I drew closer, the small things began to fray. The man on the left was wearing a watch that was 2 minutes fast. I knew for a fact that Jin-tae's real detail functioned on atomic synchronization. Their movements were timed to the millisecond. More importantly, this man didn't give me the slight, obligatory narrowing of the eyes that the regular lead guard always used to acknowledge my clearing path. He didn't look through me with the professional indifference I was used to. He looked through me as if I were truly a piece of glass, his hand twitching with a strange, hungry restlessness toward the vent of his jacket. My heart did a slow, sickening roll in my chest. I turned my gaze back to the floor, my breath hitching as I reached for the wine. In the reflection of the polished brass espresso machine at the waiter's station, I saw a sliver of the kitchen interior through the swinging double doors. A man was standing there, partially obscured by the industrial walk-in fridge. He wasn't wearing a chef's coat. He was holding an object wrapped in a gray chamois cloth, checking the action on a slide. The silhouette was unmistakable, a suppressed barrel. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The ghost security had arrived, and they weren't here to protect the man at table 4. They were the cleanup crew. I stood frozen for a heartbeat, the cold condensation of the wine bottle slick against my palm. I could walk out the back door. I could drop the tray, slip through the alley, and disappear into the Chicago rain, leaving the monsters to tear each other apart. That was the smart move. That was the ghost move. But then I looked at Jin-tae's reflection, the way he sat so unsuspecting, betrayed by the woman currently stroking his arm. I thought of the way the world treats people who are invisible, and a sudden, jagged spark of defiance lit up in my gut. My hands shook, the fine tremors threatening to rattle the crystal on my tray. I reached into my apron pocket and pulled out a crumpled guest check. With my back to the kitchen door, using my body as a shield, I scrawled 7 words in frantic, smeared ballpoint ink. Your security is gone. Don't look back. I wasn't just a waitress anymore. I was a witness to a funeral that hadn't happened yet, and I was the only person in the room with the power to stop the clock. I tucked the bill into the leather folder, smoothed my apron, and stepped back into the golden light of the dining room, walking toward the man who was 30 seconds away from a bullet. The walk from the waiter's station to table 4 felt like a march across a minefield. Every step I took on the plush, golden carpet seemed to echo in the sudden, ringing silence of my own ears. To the rest of the room, I was just Naomi, the girl who moved with practiced grace, a tray of vintage Bordeaux balanced on a steady palm. But inside, my ribs were a cage for a heart that was trying to batter its way out. Seo Jin-tae was still sitting in that same terrifyingly relaxed posture. He was the eye of a hurricane he didn't even know was forming. His fingers continued their slow, predatory rhythm on the tablecloth, a metronome counting down the seconds of his life. Chloe was still leaning into him, her hand draped over his forearm, the large emerald on her finger glittering like a snake's eye. She looked so soft, so devoted. It turned my stomach to know that the scent of her expensive perfume was probably the last thing she intended for him to smell before the gunpowder took over. Your wine, Mr. Seo, I said. My voice was a miracle. It didn't tremble. It didn't crack. It was the same professionally neutral tone I had used 1,000 times. Jin-tae didn't look up immediately. He finished whatever thought he was holding, then shifted his gaze toward the bottle. His eyes were like 2 pieces of cold flint, sharp enough to cut through the polished facade I was trying so hard to maintain. For a split second, I wondered if he could see the truth written in the dilation of my pupils. 2015, he asked, his voice a low, melodic baritone. As requested, sir, I replied. I set the bottle down and reached for the leather check presenter I had tucked under my arm. This was the moment. The ghost security near the kitchen was watching. I could feel the lead guard's eyes boring into the back of my neck, waiting for me to finish my service and clear the kill zone. If I fumbled this, if Chloe saw the note, or if Jin-tae reacted too visibly, the man with the suppressed Glock would stop being a shadow and start being a reaper. I opened the folder as if to present the bill for his signature. I leaned in, my body blocking Chloe's view of the paper. My hand, hidden by the angle of the leather, pressed the crumpled guest check firmly against the white tablecloth, sliding it directly under Jean-Tae's thumb. I didn't whisper. I didn't even look him in the eye. I just focused on the crystal glass as I poured a tasting splash of the dark red wine. Jean-Tae's rhythm stopped. The silence that followed was more deafening than a gunshot. I saw his thumb press down on the scrap of paper. I saw the slight, almost imperceptible tensing of his jaw. He didn't look at the kitchen. He didn't look at Chloe. He reached for the glass, his movement fluid and calm, but his eyes stayed on the bill. Your security is gone. Don't look back. He took a slow sip of the Bordeaux, swilling it around his palate as if he had all the time in the world. Chloe looked up then, her smile flickering with a hint of impatience. Is it to your liking, Jean? She asked, her voice like honey poured over glass. It's perfect, Jean-Tae said, his voice unchanged. He set the glass down and finally looked up at me. It wasn't the look of a customer. It was the look of a man seeing a ghost for the first time. He knew. In that single, frozen moment, he realized that the only person in this room not trying to kill him was the girl they all treated like furniture. He didn't say thank you. He didn't have to. He reached into the folder, pulled out a gold fountain pen, and scrawled a signature on the bill, but he kept the guest check hidden in his palm. Naomi, he said, using my name for the first time in 3 years. Get more ice. Now. It wasn't a request. It was a command to leave the line of fire. I nodded, my knees feeling like water. As I turned to walk away, I saw the lead guard by the kitchen door shift his weight. He was reaching into his jacket. The 30 seconds were up. I had delivered the death sentence, but as I stepped toward the service hall, I realized I hadn't just delivered it to the traitors. By choosing a side, I had signed my own name on the bottom of that bill. The ghost was dead. Naomi Carter was finally being seen, and in Jean-Tae's world, being seen was the most dangerous thing you could ever be. I didn't go for the ice. I didn't even make it 3 steps toward the service station before the world as I knew it fractured. I had lived my life in the margins, a girl who moved so quietly she didn't leave a footprint, but as I turned my back on table 4, the silence of the Aurelian grill didn't just break, it shattered. The first sound wasn't a bang. It was the sharp, clinical thwip of a suppressed round, a sound like a heavy whip cracking against water. I heard the crystal vase at the center of the neighboring table explode, showering a pair of socialites in shards of glass and expensive lilies. For a heartbeat, the room hung in a state of confused, suspended animation. People didn't scream yet. They didn't know how to process the violence invading their temple of gold and silk. Then came the roar. Co. Jean-Tae didn't dive for cover like a man in fear. He moved like a spring-loaded blade. In one fluid motion, he flipped the heavy oak dining table. The sound of $300 plates and vintage wine crashing to the floor was the starting gun for the massacre. He grabbed Chloe, the woman who had been stroking his arm seconds ago with murder in her heart, and used her as a human shield, pulling her behind the makeshift barricade just as a hail of lead tore through the leather upholstery of his chair. Get down, a voice screamed. I realized it was my own. I dived behind the brass-trimmed espresso station just as the lead guard by the kitchen door opened fire. The heavy machine thudded as bullets buried themselves in the metal casing, spraying hot steam and roasted coffee beans over my hair. The air was suddenly thick with the smell of cordite and burnt milk. Through the gap in the counter, I saw the ghost security closing in. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized efficiency, 3 men flanking from the bar and 2 more coming through the kitchen. They weren't just hitmen, they were a firing squad. Jean-Tae was trapped. He was pinned behind the table, his own security team lying dead or incapacitated in the foyer. He reached into the small of his back and pulled a sleek, matte black handgun. He didn't fire wildly. He waited. When the first attacker rounded the corner of the bar, Jean-Tae popped up and fired twice. 2 clinical thuds, and the man folded like a discarded coat. Naomi. Jean-Tae's voice sliced through the chaos, sounding impossibly calm. The service tunnel. Under the prep station. He wasn't telling me to save myself. He was telling me to give him an exit. I looked at the kitchen door. The man with the suppressed Glock was reloading, his eyes scanning the room. Between me and the prep station was 10 feet of open floor, now a literal killing field. My legs felt like they were made of lead, my lungs burning with the toxic mix of smoke and panic. I thought of the medical bills, the quiet life of a ghost, the way I had spent 24 years being afraid of my own shadow. I looked at Jin-tae. He was looking at me, his gaze as steady as a mountain. He wasn't treating me like a waitress. He was looking at me like an ally. I didn't think. I ran. The floor was slick with spilled wine and blood. I slid across the tiles, my uniform tearing as I scrambled toward the prep station. I heard the zip of a bullet pass so close to my ear that the wind of it stung my skin. I reached the heavy stainless steel table and yanked the bottom shelf aside, revealing the rusted iron ring of the old coal chute, the service tunnel that led to the sub-basement. Here, I choked out. Jin-tae didn't hesitate. He fired a final volley to suppress the guards, then lunged across the floor in a low, tactical crawl that shouldn't have been possible for a man in a bespoke suit. He reached me just as the kitchen doors burst open and 3 more gunmen flooded the room. He grabbed my collar, his grip like iron, and shoved me into the dark maw of the chute. "Jump," he commanded. "What about you?" I gasped. He looked back at the gilded room, now a ruin of broken glass and dying echoes. His face was a mask of cold, calculated fury. "I'm the one who set this cage on fire," he whispered. "I'm not leaving until it burns." He fired one last shot, hitting the chandelier above the bar. The massive crystal structure groaned and plummeted, a ton of glass and light crashing down to block the pursuit. Then he jumped in after me. We tumbled into the darkness of the sub-basement, the sounds of the massacre above fading into a muffled throb. The golden cage of the Aurelian was broken, but as we hit the cold concrete floor, I realized the real nightmare was just beginning. I wasn't a ghost anymore. I was a fugitive. And the man holding the gun next to me was the only thing standing between me and the end of my story. The damp, claustrophobic chill of the sub-basement tunnels eventually gave way to the sterile, pressurized silence of an armored SUV. The transition was a blur of shadows, the smell of wet pavement, and the low, urgent growl of a high-performance engine. By the time the world stopped moving, we were deep within a fortress of glass and steel, a penthouse that felt less like a home and more like a high-tech bunker perched above the city's slumbering skyline. It was 2 a.m. The adrenaline that had carried me through the coal chute and the service tunnels had finally evaporated, leaving behind a cold, hollow exhaustion that made my bones feel like lead. I stood in the center of the vast, open-plan living area, my black and white uniform torn, stained with coffee and the dark, copper-scented spray of wine and blood. I was an inkblot on a white marble masterpiece. Seo Jin-tae had shed his suit jacket. His white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with tension and the intricate, dark ink of dragons that seemed to writhe under the soft, recessed lighting. He wasn't bleeding, but he looked lethal. He stood by a floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the city he supposedly ruled, a glass of amber liquid in his hand that he hadn't touched. The silence was deafening. It was the kind of silence that demanded an accounting. "There is a first aid kit in the bathroom behind the kitchen," he said, his voice cutting through the room like a low-frequency hum. He didn't turn around. "And fresh clothes in the guest suite. Use them." "I don't need clothes," I whispered, my voice sounding thin and strange in the cavernous space. "I need to know if I can go home. My dad, he needs his meds at 6. If I'm not there." "You go home, you die," Jin-tae interrupted, finally turning to face me. His eyes were hooded, unreadable. "The men who raided the Aurelian aren't just hitmen. They are ghosts. My ghosts. They know your face, Naomi. They know your station. By now, they likely know your address. You crossed a line tonight that doesn't have a way back." The reality of it hit me harder than the fall through the chute. The Aurelian was gone. My paycheck was gone. The invisibility that had protected me for 24 years had been stripped away, leaving me exposed to monsters I didn't understand. I sank onto the edge of a velvet sofa, my hands starting to shake uncontrollably. "Why?" he asked. I looked up, blinking. "Why what? Why did you save me?" Jean-Tae stepped closer, his presence expanding until it seemed to fill the room. He set his glass down on a marble plinth and loomed over me, his gaze searching my face with a clinical intensity. "You could have run. You could have let the clock run out and walked out the back door. You would still have your ghost life. You would be safe. Instead, you put a target on your back for a man who has never even looked you in the eye. Why?" I looked at my hands, stained, trembling, and small. "I've spent my whole life being part of the furniture," I said, the words spilling out before I could check them. "I've watched people like you and people like Chloe treat the world like a chessboard. But I'm the one who cleans up the pieces. I saw the wrong watch. I saw the suppressed barrel. I realized that if I didn't say something, I'd be cleaning up your blood too." I stood up, forced by the sheer weight of his stare to meet his eyes. "I didn't do it because I care about your empire, Mr. CO. I did it because I'm tired of being the only person in the room who sees the truth while everyone else plays pretend. I did it because I could." Jean-Tae didn't move for a long moment. Then he took a step into my personal space, so close I could smell the faint scent of sandalwood and expensive tobacco. He reached out, his hand hovering near my face before his thumb caught a smudge of soot on my cheek, wiping it away with a surprisingly gentle pressure. "The world is full of people who see the truth, Naomi. Most of them are too terrified to speak it. You aren't just a waitress who saw too much." He leaned down, his voice dropping to a dangerous, intimate silkiness. "You're the only person who hasn't betrayed me tonight. That makes you the most valuable asset I have." He pulled back, the warmth of his touch replaced by a cold, calculating spark in his eyes. "Go clean yourself up. At dawn, we start finding the people who tried to kill us. And Naomi?" I paused at the hallway, looking back. "Don't call me Mr. CO, he said, the corner of his mouth twitching in something that wasn't quite a smile. "Ghosts don't have titles. And neither do partners." As I walked toward the guest suite, the weight of the situation shifted. I was still terrified, and I was still a fugitive. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't just part of the furniture. I was a player. And in the dark, quiet hours of the morning, I realized I didn't want to be a ghost anymore. The transition from the adrenaline of the shootout to the clinical coldness of the safe house was like being plunged into ice water. By 4 a.m., the penthouse was a cathedral of shadows and blue light emanating from a wall of monitors. Jean-Tae sat in front of the screens, his silhouette sharp against the glowing data, while I stood by the kitchen island, clutching a mug of tea as if it were the only thing keeping me anchored to the earth. He was hunting. His fingers moved across a glass keyboard with a terrifying precision, pulling up grainy security footage and encrypted logs. But he was hitting a wall. The ghost security had lived up to their name. They had wiped the restaurant's local servers before the first shot was even fired. "They didn't just replace the guards," Jean-Tae muttered, his voice raspy with a dark, simmering frustration. "They replaced the digital footprint. Someone gave them the master codes to the Aurelian's internal network. Someone who knew the overrides." I set the mug down, the ceramic clicking softly against the marble. "It's not in the servers," I said. Jean-Tae paused, his head tilting slightly but not turning. "Explain." I walked toward the glow of the monitors, feeling small in the oversized silk robe he'd given me. At the Aurelian, the staff doesn't use the main network for personal things. It's too monitored. But the guests, the VIPs, they use a private, high-speed tunnel. Chloe was on her phone the entire time. She wasn't just checking social media. She was looking at it every 30 seconds, right until the guards shifted. Jean-Tae's eyes darkened. He pulled up the guest network logs, but they were a mess of encrypted pings. "It's masked. A rotating VPN. I can't see the destination without the hardware key. You don't need the key, I whispered, stepping closer to the screens. You need the pattern. Look at the timing of her pings. Every time she looked down, the kitchen door sensor blipped. She wasn't just a passenger in this, Jin-tae. She was the conductor. She was the one signaling the ghost team when to move. I pointed to a specific timestamp on the screen. There. 3 minutes before I brought the wine. She sent a file. It's too large for a text, too small for a video. It's a floor plan. But look at the header, it's not an Aurelian file. It has a K watermark. Jin-tae froze. He leaned in, his face inches from the monitor. He recognized that watermark. It belonged to the Can Global subsidiary, the very company he had put under Chloe's management 6 months ago. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was corporate. She had used his own resources, his own encrypted servers, to map out his execution. She didn't just want me dead, Jin-tae said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, hollow whisper. She wanted the transition to be seamless. She was moving assets into escrow while she was laughing at my jokes. He tapped a few keys, bypassing the secondary firewall using a backdoor code he clearly hadn't shared with her. A hidden folder materialized. Within it were a series of recorded calls Chloe had made from the penthouse itself. He played the most recent one. The audio was crisp, the voice unmistakable. It was Chloe, but the honey was gone. Her voice was as cold as a morgue slab. He's suspicious. The waitress saw something. We move now, or we lose the window. Kill them both. I want Jin-tae's ring on the table by midnight, and I want the girl's body in the river. Do not fail me again, Juno. The name Juno hung in the air like a poisonous fog. Jin-tae's hand curled into a fist so tight his knuckles turned white. Juno was his brother, the one he had sent into exile 3 years ago to save his life. The betrayal was a circle. His lover and his blood had joined hands to bury him. I looked at Jin-tae, expecting an explosion of rage. Instead, he was eerily still. The clinical monster had returned, but this time, it was fueled by a cold, absolute clarity. He turned to look at me, and for the first time, I didn't see a mafia boss. I saw a man who had realized he was standing on an island, and I was the only other soul on it. She's at the secondary estate in the North Woods, Jin-tae said, his eyes reflecting the blue light of the betrayal. She thinks I'm dead, and she thinks you're a ghost in the wind. She's waiting for a confirmation that will never come. He stood up, the dragons on his arms seeming to pulse in the low light. He walked over to a heavy mahogany cabinet and pulled out a smaller, more compact weapon, a lightweight ceramic pistol. He held it out to me, the handle toward my chest. You said you were tired of being part of the furniture, Naomi, he said, his gaze locking onto mine. Chloe thinks you're a loose end. I think you're the only person who can get close enough to her to see the look on her face when she realizes I'm still breathing. I looked at the gun, then back at him. My life as a waitress ended the moment I scrawled that note, but my life as his partner was beginning in the shadows of this betrayal. I reached out and took the weapon. It was cold, heavy, and carried the weight of 1,000 choices I could never take back. Tell me what we do next, I said. Jin-tae leaned in, his forehead almost touching mine. Next, we stop clearing tables. We start flipping them. The transition didn't happen in a gym or a shooting range. It happened in the quiet, pressurized intervals between heartbeats. For the next 48 hours, the penthouse became a cocoon of lethal intent. The silk robe I'd been wearing was replaced by tactical gear, black, matte, and silent, that felt like a second skin. It was heavier than my waitress's apron, but for the first time in my life, the weight didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a promise. Jin-tae was a relentless architect of my transformation. He didn't try to turn me into a soldier. He knew that was a lie the enemy would see through. Instead, he taught me to weaponize the very thing I had hated, my invisibility. They see a woman in a service uniform, and their brains shut off. Naomi, he said, his voice a low rasp as he stood behind me, adjusting my grip on the ceramic pistol. The heat from his body was a sharp contrast to the cold steel in my hand. To them, you are a ghost. A non-entity. You don't move like a threat, you move like a shadow. Use that. When you walk into a room, don't look for the exits. Look for the vulnerabilities. Every man has a rhythm. Find the break in theirs. He pushed me until my muscles screamed, forcing me to move through the penthouse's sprawling layout without making a sound, practicing the art of the approach. I learned that the way I used to carry a heavy tray of drinks was the same way I needed to carry my center of gravity to stay silent on marble floors. The grace I had perfected at the Aurelian was no longer for the comfort of the guests, it was for the execution of a predator. Between the drills, the transformation was internal. I spent hours staring at the city lights, the ceramic weapon resting on my lap. I thought about my father, tucked away in a secure private wing of a hospital Jintae's money had bought in an hour. I thought about the girl who used to flinch when a customer raised their voice. She was dying piece by piece, being replaced by someone who looked at a floor plan and saw a kill zone. Jintae watched me from the shadows of the living room, his unreadable flint-gray eyes tracking every movement. There was no pity in his gaze, only a dark, growing respect. He didn't offer comfort, but he offered a strange kind of equality. On the second night, he presented me with a small velvet box. Inside wasn't jewelry, but a high-frequency earpiece and a set of contact lenses that acted as a heads-up display. Chloe is hosting a private wake for her fallen fiancé at the Northwoods estate tomorrow, he said, his fingers brushing against mine as I took the box. She invited the very syndicates she sold me out to. She thinks she's celebrating a coronation. She expects a catering crew of 20. I looked at my reflection in the dark glass of the window. The girl in the crisp black uniform was gone. In her place was a woman with cold eyes and a steady hand. I wasn't just wearing armor under my clothes, I was becoming it. I know the Northwoods layout, I said, my voice steady, devoid of the tremor that had defined my life. I know how the service entrance operates. I know where the blind spots are in the security rotation. They won't see a waitress, Jintae. They won't see anything at all. He stepped into the light, the dragons on his neck seeming to pulse. He reached out, his hand cupping the back of my neck, pulling me inches from his face. The air between us was thick with the scent of sandalwood and the cold, metallic tang of the weapons scattered on the table. You aren't a ghost anymore, Naomi, he whispered, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw with a predatory tenderness. You're the storm they never saw coming. Tomorrow, we show them that when you bury a king, you'd better make sure his queen isn't still standing. I leaned into his touch, the fear that had been my constant companion finally replaced by a sharp, jagged hunger for justice. The apron was a memory. The armor was real. And as the sun began to bleed over the Chicago skyline, I knew that when I walked into that estate, I wouldn't be clearing any more tables. I would be clearing the room. The Northwoods estate was a monolith of glass and cedar, perched on the edge of a frozen lake like a predator waiting for the ice to break. It was a house built for transparency, yet every inch of it was currently crawling with lies. As the white catering van rattled up the winding driveway, I felt the familiar weight of the ceramic pistol pressed against my thigh, hidden beneath the starch of a fresh white apron. I wasn't Naomi Carter, the girl who had barely survived a massacre. I was just service staff number 6, one of a dozen anonymous bodies hired through a shell agency Jintae had subverted hours before. The security at the gate was tight, ghost security in tactical gear, their eyes scanning for armored SUVs and rival hitmen. They didn't even look at my face. They checked my crate of crystal stemware, glanced at my forged ID, and waved the van through with a grunt of indifference. Jintae was right. To men like this, I didn't exist. I was the help. I was part of the background noise. Inside, the estate hummed with the dissonant energy of a celebration masquerading as a wake. Chloe moved through the great hall like a mourning widow in a dress of black silk that cost more than my father's life, but her eyes were bright with a triumphant, feverish heat. She was holding court, surrounded by the heads of the city's most ruthless syndicates, serving them the empire she had stolen from Jintae's supposed grave. "Move it, 6, a supervisor barked, snapping his fingers at me. "The champagne isn't going to pour itself." I lowered my head, the HUD in my contact lenses flickering to life, highlighting the thermal signatures of the guards stationed in the rafters and behind the velvet curtains. I moved with the practiced, fluid grace of the Aurelian, threading through the crowd of monsters without ever brushing a shoulder. I cleared empty flutes and replaced hors d'oeuvres, all while mapping the room's vulnerabilities. 3 guards on the balcony, 1 near the master study. "The mistress is vulnerable at the North Terrace." Jintae's voice crackled in my earpiece, a low, ghost-like rasp that felt like a caress. "I'm in position at the perimeter, Naomi. The moment the lights flicker, the invisibility ends." "How does she look?" I paused near a pillar, my eyes tracking Chloe as she laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "She looks like she thinks she's won," I whispered into the collar of my shirt. "She looks like she's forgotten that ghosts can haunt you." I moved toward the kitchen, my heart a steady, rhythmic drum. Every step was a calculation. I noticed the way the lead guard near the terrace leaned more on his left leg, an old injury. I noticed the blind spot created by the massive floral arrangement near the bar. I was no longer seeing a party, I was seeing a tactical grid. I slipped into the pantry, away from the prying eyes of the other staff. My hands didn't shake as I reached into a crate of napkins and pulled out the small, high-frequency jammer Jintae had given me. I placed it behind a rack of vintage cognac, the red light pulsing once, a silent heartbeat. "The net is cast," I breathed. "Good," Jintae replied. "Now, give them the bill, Naomi." I stepped back out into the hall, a silver tray of champagne in my hands. I wasn't just clearing tables anymore. I was moving toward the center of the web. As I approached the terrace where Chloe stood, her back to the glass, I realized the girl from the Aurelian was truly dead. This woman, the one walking toward the traitor with a hidden weapon and a cold heart, was someone Chloe hadn't accounted for. I was the variable. I was the invisible hand of justice. And as I reached the edge of the terrace, I didn't just see a mistress, I saw a target. The art of being invisible was over. It was time to be seen. The gala was a masterpiece of deception, a gilded stage where the actors didn't realize the script had been rewritten. The grand ballroom of the Northwoods estate was a sea of velvet and diamonds, illuminated by massive crystal chandeliers that cast a deceptive, flickering warmth over the faces of the city's most dangerous men. I moved through the crowd with the invisible efficiency of a shadow, carrying a tray of obsidian-colored caviar. My eyes, enhanced by the HUD in my contacts, saw the room in layers of red and green. I saw the heat signatures of the men with rifles perched in the musicians' gallery. I saw the nervous twitch in the hands of the underbosses who suspected a power vacuum. And at the center of it all, I saw Chloe. She stood on a raised dais, a queen in mourning, holding a glass of vintage champagne as if it were a scepter. Beside her stood Juno, Jintae's brother, looking every bit the grieving heir while his eyes scanned the room for any sign of dissent. They were the architects of the lie, the ones who had told the world that Seo Jintae was dead, executed in a restaurant shootout by a nameless girl. To the future, Juno announced, his voice booming through the hall. To a Chicago united under one banner, and to the memory of my brother, who lacked the vision to see this day. A chorus of polite, murderous clinking echoed through the room. It was a toast to a corpse that wasn't there. I approached the dais, my head bowed just enough to signify submission. The service staff number 6 persona was a perfect suit of armor. I could feel Chloe's gaze wash over me, a brief, dismissive flick of her eyes that didn't even register my humanity. To her, I was just a delivery system for her next luxury. "Champagne, madam?" I asked, my voice a whisper of professional silk. "Leave the tray," she commanded, not even looking at me. She was too busy leaning into Juno, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial hum. "Is the perimeter clear? I want the transition finalized before dawn." The ghost team has the exits, Juno replied, his hand resting on the small of her back. Jin-tae is a memory, Chloe. By morning, even the rumors of him will be buried. I set the tray down on the marble table beside them, my fingers lingering for a fraction of a second on the base of her glass. Tucked underneath was a small, black disc, the secondary jammer. In my earpiece, the silence of the penthouse had been replaced by the low, predatory growl of a car engine. I'm at the gate, Naomi. Jin-tae's voice was a cold current in my ear. The gala of lies is over. Tell them the truth is coming. I didn't run. I didn't flinch. I reached out and took a single glass from the tray, holding it up as if to check its clarity against the light. Then I leaned in, my shadow falling over Chloe's shoulder. Mr. CO says the vintage is a bit too young for a wake, I whispered. Chloe froze. The blood drained from her face so fast it was like watching a ghost manifest in real time. She turned, her eyes widening as they finally, truly settled on my face. Recognition hit her like a physical blow, the waitress from the Aurelian. The girl who was supposed to be a body in the river. You, she breathed, the word a strangled gasp. Me, I replied, a jagged, cold smile touching my lips. At that exact moment, the massive chandeliers overhead flickered once, twice, and then died. The ballroom was plunged into a terrifying, velvet darkness, broken only by the panicked shouts of men and the sudden, violent roar of an explosion at the front gates. The gala of lies was over. The king wasn't dead, and his ghost had just handed the bill to the traitors. I reached for the ceramic pistol at my thigh, the weight of it finally coming home. The invisibility was gone. The storm was here. The darkness was absolute for only a heartbeat before the emergency strobes kicked in, bathing the chaos in a rhythmic, violent pulse of white light. The Northwoods estate, once a sanctuary of luxury, transformed into a slaughterhouse in seconds. Shouts of confusion turned into screams as the syndicates realized the perimeter had been breached not by the police, but by the man they had just hosted as a corpse. I didn't wait for the light. I had memorized the layout of the dais in the dark. As Juno lunged for his weapon, I stepped into his guard, the movement fluid and devoid of the hesitation that had once defined Naomi Carter. I didn't use my gun, not yet. I used the weight of the silver champagne tray, swinging it with a sharp, horizontal arc that caught him across the temple. He went down with a heavy thud, his dreams of an empire silenced by the very tool of my former trade. Chloe was a different story. She scrambled backward, her black silk gown catching on the corner of the marble table. Her face was a mask of primal terror, the diamond earrings she wore flickering like frantic stars in the strobe light. You're a waitress, she shrieked, her voice cracking over the sound of a distant explosion. You're nothing. I'm the one who's still standing, I said, my voice cold and leveled. I raised the ceramic pistol, the red dot of the laser sight settling squarely on the center of her chest. Before I could pull the trigger, the massive oak doors at the end of the hall were blown off their hinges. The frame didn't just break, it disintegrated. Through the smoke and the settling dust walked Jin-tae. He looked like a god of war returned from the underworld, his white shirt stained with the soot of the gate's destruction, a heavy tactical rifle held in a casual, terrifying grip. The room went deathly silent, the remaining syndicate bodyguards lowering their weapons. You don't fight a ghost that has walked through fire to find you. Jin-tae didn't look at the cowering underbosses or the fallen Juno. His eyes locked onto mine across the wreckage of the gala. He saw the gun in my hand, the steady set of my shoulders, and the woman I had become in the 48 hours since we fell through the coal chute. A slow, dark satisfaction settled over his features. He walked toward the dais, stepping over the discarded diamonds and broken glass. He stopped beside me, the scent of sandalwood and gunpowder enveloping us both. He looked down at Chloe, who was now trembling at his feet. The bill is due, Chloe, Jin-tae said, his voice a low, melodic promise of ruin. And Naomi is the one who's going to collect. He didn't kill her. That would have been too quick. Instead, he signaled to his real security team, the men who had been waiting in the shadows for his return, to take her and Juno away. Their empire was being dismantled in real time. Outside, the city's skyline was dotted with the fires of Jin-tae's counterstrike. Every warehouse, every shell company, every mole Chloe had cultivated was being burned out of existence. We stood on the terrace, watching the city glow with the orange light of a cleansing fire. The Chicago wind howled against the glass, but for the first time, I didn't feel suffocated by the warmth. I felt alive. What happens now? I asked, my hand finally lowering the weapon. Jin-tae turned to me, his hand reaching out to cut my jaw. His touch was no longer clinical, it was possessive, weighted with the respect of a man who had found his equal in the most unlikely of places. Now, we rebuild. The Aurelian is gone, Naomi. But I think I prefer the view from here. He leaned in, his forehead resting against mine. My father's medical care? I whispered, needing to hear it one last time. Guaranteed for life, he promised. And you? You never have to carry a tray again. Unless you want to clear the board entirely. I looked out at the burning horizon, the red light of the fires reflecting in my eyes. I thought of the girl in the polyester blend uniform, the ghost who was afraid to be seen. She was gone, consumed by the same flames currently eating the city. I wasn't just a partner or a witness. I was the Queen's gambit that had actually worked. I think I'll stay, I said, my voice echoing the ironclad certainty of the man beside me. I've spent enough time in the shadows. I want to see what the world looks like when I'm the one holding the match. Jin-tae smiled, a real, dangerous smile that promised a future written in gold and blood. He took my hand, his fingers interlacing with mine, and together we walked out of the ruins of the old world and into the heat of the new one we had just set on fire.